The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins? Edgar Allan Poe, 1809 to 1849. A voice from the grave. Though the heat of the summer night was unbearable, heavy draperies were pulled tightly over the open windows, shutting out any breath of air that might be stirring. Gloom blanketed the room like the black velvet folds of a burial pall. A single candle burned without flickering in the oppressive stillness. Alexander Hostler sat, as he had for 2 days and nights, in an almost catatonic state, devastated by the untimely death of his best friend. Hostler's face was a mask of agony. The silence in the room was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a mantel clock, until a voice called his name. Alexander. He whirled around, angry at this intrusion into his private moments of grief. He was ill prepared for what he saw. The warm blood that had signaled his anger seconds before now felt like ice water in his veins. A phantom figure, seeming to glow from its own unearthly light, stood before him in the darkness. The ghostly countenance was that of his dead companion, Samuel Jocelyn. Plaintively, the figure spoke, a hollow, faraway sound, but nonetheless recognizable as the voice of his friend. It was not the sound, but the words themselves which filled him with unimaginable terror. Alexander, how could you let them bury me when I was not yet dead? In utter disbelief and panic, Alexander cried out, "It cannot be, surely not." "You have but to open my coffin to know the truth," the specter replied, and vanished. Shock gave way to fear and then to doubt. Alexander tried to convince himself that what he had seen was a product of his imagination. In his distraught state, he must be hallucinating, he reasoned. It could not be true. The idea of his friend being buried alive was inconceivable. He knew he must say nothing to anyone of the strange occurrence, lest they think him deranged from melancholia and depression. He decided to put the incident out of his mind. But how could he put aside such a monstrous thing when the events of the past week and all the years before would not leave him in peace for a single instant? He was besieged by a million mental images of happier times, each taunting him with the grim reality of his loss. Since early childhood, the boys had been inseparable. Their Sunday school teacher even nicknamed them Jonathan and David because their devotion to each other so resembled that of the two young biblical friends. As youngsters, they had played along the riverbank, reliving the stories of pirates long dead and searching for buried treasure. They had fished there, learned to row a dinghy, done 1,001 things that boys do. They had gone through school together, shared the same teachers, agonized over the mysteries of algebra and geometry. When the time came to court the young ladies, they were present at every cotillion, learning the social graces that were expected of polite Southern gentlemen, always attracting the fairest in the crowd. Samuel was the son of a prominent Wilmington attorney, and both he and his friend Alexander Hostler enjoyed a fine reputation in the community. Their circle of friends was wide. The two young men in their early 20s were known to be of impeccable character with the highest moral standards. No hint of scandal had ever touched their lives. No major sadness or tragedy had occurred to mar their youthful happiness. No one had ever heard the two say a cross word to each other. Conjoined twins could not have been closer. As they grew to manhood, their childish games turned to more intellectual pursuits. They were fascinated with the study of metaphysics and often engaged in discussions with their friends about such matters. They were the favorites among their peers and much respected for their insights and observations concerning things philosophical and spiritual. One warm summer day in the year 1810, in just such a discussion, the talk turned to life after death. Despite the friendly ridicule and teasing of many in the group, Alexander and Samuel stood firm in their conviction that communication beyond the grave was a possibility. They even made a pact that afternoon, witnessed by all. If one of them should die, he would try in some way to communicate with the living friend. Undaunted by the laughter of their comrades, the two men were convinced that some form of communication would indeed be achievable. Months later, those very skeptics would remember that conversation in detail. Ironically, horseback riding, the sport which Samuel loved most and at which he excelled, was the only activity the two men did not enjoy in common. Perhaps Alexander was afraid of horses, or perhaps it bothered him that he was not as skillful a horseman as his friend. Whatever the reason, those times when Samuel went riding were the only times the two were not together. Samuel loved nothing better than to race his horse along the low-lying sandy roads near the river. And it was there, under the sprawling branches of a giant live oak tree, that his almost lifeless body was discovered just a few months after the life and death pact had been made. Samuel was such an accomplished equestrian that Alexander could hardly believe the terrible accident had befallen him. Two men in a horse-drawn cart happened along the way shortly after Samuel Jocelyn was apparently thrown from his horse. He was lying unconscious beside the road. His horse was calmly grazing just a short distance away. As the men drew closer, they recognized Jocelyn and rushed to place his badly bruised body in the cart. They hastened to reach his home, uncertain whether Jocelyn was alive or dead. His parents summoned the family doctor, who came immediately and did all within his power to revive the young man. But a few hours later, Samuel Jocelyn was pronounced dead, without ever having regained consciousness. The body was prepared for burial and, according to custom, remained for viewing in the family home for 2 days before the funeral and interment in St. James Churchyard on the corner of 4th and Market Streets. It would be impossible to describe the grief that Alexander Hostler felt at the death of his lifelong friend. No words of consolation could assuage his anguish and remorse. He blamed himself for not being there, thinking that in some way he might have prevented the terrible accident. Hostler's family and friends knew that he wished only to be left alone in his despair, and so he had been, until the voice of his dead friend disturbed his solitude. The night following that first ghostly visitation, Alexander Hostler, lost once more in his doleful reverie, sat in his darkened room. As if by appointment, the voice of Samuel Jocelyn called his name and once again asked the terrifying question. "Alexander, why did you let them bury me when I was not yet dead?" This time the tone was more insistent. "But you were dead," Alexander cried in reply. "The doctor said you were, and I saw you myself." He began to sob uncontrollably. "Within my coffin lies the truth. Look there, and you will know." The spirit spoke and was gone. Hostler was beside himself, yet he was even more convinced than on the previous night that he had heard was impossible. He was certain that in his despair, his imagination was playing cruel tricks with his mind. Again, he said nothing to anyone for fear of being thought mentally unstable. The story might never have been told had it not been for a third and far more terrifying appearance by the apparition on the following night. This time, the voice implored Alexander to validate its grisly revelation by examining the contents of the coffin. Knowing now that there would be no rest for the spirit or himself if he did nothing, and convinced by this time that he was not hallucinating, Alexander contacted a good friend who was also a citizen of much prominence and credibility in the community. The man's name was Louis Toomer. Something in Hostler's manner must have persuaded Toomer that his story was true, for together the two went to the parents of Samuel Jocelyn with their awful tale. The Jocelyns gave their permission for the body to be disinterred, but they stipulated that the investigation must be done in secret, so as not to attract curiosity seekers. Accordingly, the plans were made, and the next night, shortly after midnight, Hostler and Lewis Toomer made their way stealthily to the gravesite. The earth was still soft, easy to turn with their shovels, and in a very short time, the coffin was exposed. Toomer held the carefully shielded lantern, and the two men noted with horror that one side of the coffin had been loosened. Fearful of what he would find, Alexander anxiously pried open the lid. In the dim light, a gruesome scene was revealed. The white satin lining of the casket was torn and bloody. The burial clothes lay in shreds. Most horrifying of all, the body was lying face down. Alexander Hostler sank to his knees, covered his eyes with his hands, and rocked back and forth in his wretchedness. His agonized cries of mourning split the silence of the night in a wild, primitive lament. For the rest of his life, Alexander Hostler would live with the sorrow and pain of the hideous truth he had uncovered that night.